about their policy, and inform their policy with behavioral insights, which could potentially then be taken to scale. And we have a lot of projects that have gone to scale over millions of people. Because we are at this intersection of this schizophrenic sort of tension between the two sides, I think I am able to make a few comments about credibility of research. What drives academics doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and what drives academics to be doing things that they should be doing, and so on. So, as I see it, the replication crisis of the bat, I think, is comprised of two varieties. On one hand, you have a failure of replication of an experiment or a piece of knowledge because you have undertaken a piece of research in one location, and there are, heterogeneous factors of that location which, perhaps have provided some basis for the success of your hypothesis in that location. You've done something in Hyderabad, it has worked really, really well. But now when you take it to a different location, there may be features in that new location which do not allow for the replication of that piece of that experiment. And that's a failure in replication. It's not a failure in science. It's not a crisis, but it's actually new knowledge. So this alerts us to one very fundamental thing about behavior science. On one hand, behavior science uncovers truths about human behavior, which are in some sense fundamental across all cultures and across all geographies in some sense. And when there is a failure in replication of that, then there is a problem. But if behavior science deals with context-specific features, which is the second type of behavior science, then that may not replicate too well. So it's not really a crisis, but it's merely the fact that an experiment has not replicated because there are new things, or there's a new location where the hypothesis doesn't work well. But there's a second kind of a replication failure, and that's on account of fraud, academic fraud. And we have in recent times witnessed this. There's the Dan Ariely sort of example, and then there's the Geno example from Harvard, and so on. I will not make a comment about whether they have engaged in fraud or not, but nevertheless, they have alerted us to the fact that there could potentially be fraud. And if we were to examine the sort of the incentive structures of academics, we begin to notice that they are incentivized for producing novel knowledge. And novelty becomes the sort of the driving force. Why? How does a researcher work? Goes to the literature, finds holes in the literature, and tries to fill those holes in the literature to create something new. So there's always this persistent and relentless pressure to be cool. I call this the coolness bias. And academics, find themselves in this absurd position of needing to be spectacular and entertaining each time that they do research. And that does not happen all the time. And it's not inconceivable for academics then to then become entertainers, to conjure up the requisite data to become entertainers and fill up those gaps with false data. And then that becomes the basis for the problems that we have with science. So in some sense, we need to locate the problem with the incentive structure of the academic world. And I'm not quite sure that the incentive structure in the academic world is aligned in such a way that people are honest all the time. So for instance, one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, do we have social norms which punish fraudsters when they're detected? Now, if we can't find those fraudsters with sufficient degree of probability, can we increase the level of punishment to then compensate for the lack of monitoring? I mean, I'm applying Gary Becker's economics of crime in a very crude sense, right? To see how we can make social norms work in the academic context. So now, replication crisis doesn't arise merely at this grand, academic level, but it can also happen on account of the incentive structure at the data collection level, right? I mean, we do a lot of research, and I can tell you it's just not easy to align the incentives of the enumerators to collect data in an honest manner sometimes. Why? Because, okay, the problem can arise in a couple of ways. Your survey instrument itself is pretty complicated. And if you want to run a survey-based experiment, the instructions can be very complex. And it imposes a cognitive load on the enumerator who's subjecting the subject to these complex questions, and they lose interest. And it's a hot summer day somewhere in Uttar Pradesh, and there's fatigue. So the quick and easy way is to go to the local cafeteria and fill up the questionnaires and say that they've done the work. I mean, you have back checks and so on, but the incentives at the grassroots level of collecting data then become very, very challenging. And that is a process that I think we need to try and understand. And it's not an easy problem to solve, right? So that's a challenge. And then there are, of course, challenges with online data because then you have sample bias. Then you have challenges with the way you ask questions. There's desirability bias because people don't want to give you the real answer. Then you want to use revealed preferences, which is a way of rewarding people for the decisions that they make, so that they're making their choices in your experiment in a manner that is true to what they believe in. So there are these fundamental challenges, methodological as well as incentive-based challenges, which I think animate this crisis that we are witnessing, right? But coolness bias is something that we need to address at a very fundamental level in the way that we govern institutions, in the way that we govern research organizations. And then the breakdown of trust, the deficit of trust that we witness in the contemporary world with the internet, misinformation, the post-truth phenomenon. I mean, take for instance what happened during the pandemic, hydroxychloroquine or the other drug that that the Latin Americans, we just didn't know what was true and what was false. So the post-truth phenomena that applies to politics also applies to science, right? And we need to be worried about that. Now we need to start thinking about solutions for them. So this is my initial set of comments, but I'm also happy to receive thoughts about behavior sciences in combination with AI, the ethics of it. How does it impact autonomy? I would love to hear Marty's thoughts on that. And how do we regulate the market in such a way that there's no concentration of ownership of service providers who use AI and nudging, etc. That's a tidal wave that's going to hit us, right? I would love to have a discussion about that as well. Thank you. Let me stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Pavan. And really, I think important points raised, about the systems of incentives and, general, the kind of procedural forces as well in research, it can lead to these kind of issues. I would like to now invite Dr. Malte to please take over and give his opening remarks on our discussion.
Thank you, Karan. And yeah, this was excellent, Pawan. Thanks. I think there's a lot in there. And I will mention a few similar points, but hopefully add something. I will share my slides. I prepared a little slide deck. And what I will also try to do is to relate this discussion about the replication crisis, not just in behavioral economics, but also what it means for public policy. So BPP, the field of behavioral public policy, where we use behavioral insights to design better policies. Now, this is sort of what I want to do. I want to briefly summarize, what is the replication crisis, and Pawan already gave you a good idea of that, and then sort of zoom in on the behavioral public policy side of it. And I want to be constructive here. I want to also say something, and deliver here a qualified defense actually of behavioral economics. And I think I want to add a point and say, how can we shift the debate away from the destructive side to a more constructive debate and maybe see a way forward for behavioral economics and for behavioral public policy? Now, when you think about the replication crisis, you can have a wide or narrow understanding of it. I mean, a wide understanding would be anything basically that contributes to a low replicability of results in behavioral economics. And of course, Pawan already mentioned that, you could see that there's bad statistics, but there's also fabrication and fraud involved. And particularly when you look at the incentive structure, as Pawan mentioned, they often work against, a truthful, delivery and a truthful conducting of one's research. And some of the very famous behavioral economists have fall prey to the temptation to engage in that. Now, the more narrow one would be that the low replicability that we have of the results is due to a series of problems with the way behavioral economics is taught and practiced. And I think there we can really also do something. It's not just, the researchers engaging with it, but it is also the way we teach it. There's a number of issues that we can teach our students in grad school, how to avoid publication bias, how to avoid p-hacking. Now, p-hacking, for those of you who don't know exactly what it is, I have here sort of this quote, drawing the bullseye after you made the shots, meaning you have your data set and you slice it up to a point when you find finally a statistically significant effect, right? And the idea would be you shouldn't do that, of course. You should have the theory, what you're going to do before you engage in your data analysis. So the bullseye needs to be drawn before you actually call or make the shots. Now, both are problematic, I think, and we seriously need to think about redesigning some of the incentive structure that people do not engage in fraud. But I think the latter one is even more intricate, that the way we teach and practice it might be problematic. And I think, and this is the positive message here, I think we can engage in better teaching and practice of behavioral economics, and particularly along two axes, you could say. One would be to really engage also in theorizing. One of the problems was that, and particularly in psychology, but behavioral economics being very close to psychology, that there often is a perceived lack, but also a real lack of a unifying theory. And there's a lot of empirical studies without theorizing. I think that's problematic. And the second point is there's not really a standardized methodology, for example, for one of the core questions of behavioral economics. What are social preferences and how can we actually measure them? Now, this is a little piece of hope here. When we compare actually the replicability in behavioral economics compared to psychology, we see that behavioral economics is not as bad. Okay, this was sort of a study by Colin Camera and co-authors published in Science, 18 studies in the top journals, American Economic Review and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And what you see here, the main takeaway here is the orange bar, being behavioral economics, is always higher than the one for psychology. Now, you might say, these numbers are in the 60 to, high 70 percentage of replicability. That's also not great, but it's not as bad, as in psychology. So the situation is not perfect, but not as dire as the one in psychology. So I think that's important to see, to not lump, the replication crisis and the behavioral sciences all together. Now, what I want to emphasize here, and I said that at the outset, the replication crisis didn't just affect theory, it also affected, those tools that we have in the policy world, such as nudges, where behavioral scientists went into the field, had interventions, tested for them. What we see here, and there were a bunch of meta-analyses in the last few years, that nudges, the idea that we change the choice architecture slightly of people, not by changing incentives, but by changing psychological cues in the environment to help people make better choices, right? And we see that those nudges are not as effective as the original researchers basically were selling. Particularly when you correct for certain biases, that the publication bias being one, that you run studies, but you only publish those that are statistically significant, and that's of course a serious problem. Moreover, what is also important is the effect of nudges appear larger when you define them very narrowly and on a shorter time horizon, right? An intervention might be very salient when you introduce a nudge, but it might wane off over time, and we really have to take care of that, of course, in the policy world, when we make these interventions, what happens in a longer time horizon. Now, the main takeaway, I think, of this debate is that nudges often do not scale up and are not as persistent as they are. I think it's not a damning critique, but one has to be careful. Now, what is the way forward? I said I want to be constructive. So a way forward is, I think we can defend behavioral economics, and I also think we can slightly reshift maybe the debate away from this nudging stuff to a more structural interpretation of what behavioral economics can do in behavioral public policy. Now, let me start with the first point, this qualified defense. I think it's important when you look at some of the core findings in behavioral economics around bounded rationality, bounded willpower, bounded selfishness, they held up pretty nicely. It is often the fancy studies, the sexy studies, that didn't hold up. But when you look at these core findings, they held up quite nicely. Framing and risk preferences, hyperbolic discounting, meaning that we discount, the next time period more heavily. Social preferences in dictator game, ultimatum game, or public goods games, are all findings that are pretty stable. And actually, when you go back 40, 50 years, no economist would believe in these systematic findings. So there is a real contribution, and we have really learned something from behavioral economics. Also, when you look at prospect theory, now prospect theory has haters and lovers, but when you look sort of at some of the meta-analyses, prospect theory cannot explain everything, of course, but when you interpret it in a context-sensitive way, what do I mean by that? In certain contexts of our of human decision-making, prospect theory is really helpful in explaining the reference dependence of our decision-making processes. Now, what is the general rule of thumb, to sort these things out? What is good and what is bad? I think this is a very important question, again, particularly when we teach behavioral economics. There are repeated robust studies. I think it's important to focus on them, but we have to differentiate them from atheoretical, singular and sexy findings. What do I mean by singular and sexy findings? Think about something like warm coffee makes people warmer in social interactions, or matcha-like pose for a minute increases your testosterone level and confidence. All that stuff, I mean, it's very sexy, catchy, can be published in a newspaper or on a blog, but there's a likelihood there's not much theory involved, and there's a high likelihood that it might not be replicable. So I think that's important to consider. And you could summarize that under that headline, avoid sensationalism and atheoretical studies. And here's just a Twitter, a little tweet here. A bad publication would be something like, touching a stuffed animal increases stated willingness to purchase by 3.1%. And you might find a statistically significant effect there, but the question is, how much theory is there? What went on in the study? Was there p-hacking involved? And what do you make of it when you sell your result? And don't say then something like, the power of softness to shape our lives and transform our economy. Now, many behavioral economists have been engaging in that type of translation to blow up their findings. And I think that was a real problem in the field and contributed to the negative reaction of some of the standard economists. I think it's that success in mainstream media that is not really backed up by good empirical studies. And there was a recent article that I recommend for everybody, published in 2019, that really makes the case for theory in behavioral economics, not just run your studies, but engage in theory making. Now, what I also want to mention, there were a bunch of methodological developments in recent years, that really were a reaction to the crisis, particularly in psychology, that findings couldn't be replicated. And a really important one is pre-registration. So you register your study before you collect your data. You have your theory, you have your clear prediction, your experimental design, how you gather your data. And it's really, really important that we hold each other accountable as researchers, as peer reviewer, as journal editors, that people do that. And again, also in teaching, when we teach behavioral economics. And I just have this finding for you. When medical studies began actually using pre-registration, what you see is that, basically 57% of drug trials finding a significant effect was reduced to only 8%. And I think that's important to see, that 8%, is still something, but many of the studies, of course, have been engaging in this sort of p-hacking or bad statistics. I think what is also important, collecting more data, when you look at the early studies, including some of the studies Daniel Kahneman did, they're very small sample sizes, so we have to be aware that we shouldn't run studies that are statistically underpowered. materials, including data sets, have to upload it to open archives to engage ensure transparency. And I think what is also important, and that's also a recent encouraging development, that people engage in open science collaboration, or many labs, so you do not have just one lab, but many labs engage in sort of trying to replicate key findings in the field. And that's something where we, of course, as journal editors, also have to be open to publish replicated results, including results, I mean, so-called null results, where we do not find something. That's really a contribution to the literature. And what I also want to throw out there, and Danny Kahneman was actually a proponent of that we engage in adversarial collaboration. Sometimes you have these camps, right? People arguing in this case here, for a conjunction fallacy. And some people say, oh, this effect disappears if you redesign the study and give people sort of a frequency representation. And then you can say, well, let's engage in this adversarial collaboration and learn from each other about this question. I think that's an encouraging way forward. What I also want to note is that to falsify a study, or to have a falsified study, in the greater scheme of things, is not a bad thing. That means that's the way we move forward in science. And if you think not just about behavioral economics, but many of the big empirical studies in economics have been later on falsified, or people found some mistakes, and that's an important way to move a field forward. And it's not a negative sign of a systematic problem within a field necessarily. I just want to make that side note. Now, I want to end on this another constructive note, and that is, how can we shift the debate of how we use behavioral insights in public policy? The nudging literature basically engages in this idea that we can have easy cookie cutter solutions to complicated problems, right? That we just have to tweak the choice architecture and then we get people to choose and do the right thing. And I think, it's not a trivial point, but I think it's an obvious point to some degree, that social problems are often very complex, and they require what Nick Chater and George Loewenstein call S-frame interventions, not I-frame interventions. S-frame interventions are, you use behavioral insights, but you change the rules of the game. You do not just try to change, individual choice settings. And I think that's very important to see. Often we have to do more than just change the choice architecture to solve a problem such as climate change, obesity, retirement savings, pollution from plastic waste. All these examples are situations where nudges have involved, but I think it needs more. Obesity, for example, I teach in the United States, where obesity is a real problem. And, not just try to help obese people to consume less, but you can clearly see it's not just a problem of individual consumption. It might be a structural problem, including subsidized sugary drinks that were pushed into the market. Now, what is the contribution of behavioral economics and all that? I think behavioral economics can help us to understand unintended consequences of S-frame interventions. I think when you try to change the incentives, sometimes they can backfire. Why? Because we're more complex than standard economics assumes. I think that's important to see the complex motivational setup of people that help, and behavioral economics helps allude to this complexity. And the last point I want to make is that there is a different type of behavioral economics that Carla Hoff and Joseph Stiglitz call strand 2 behavioral economics. It is a behavioral economics that is not just focused on the way we standardly teach behavioral economics. Incentives matter, but then it's the situational choice context that affects our choices, such as framing, situational influences, etc., that makes our preferences context dependent. I think there is a different interpretation and a more sociologically rich interpretation of behavioral economics that interprets behavioral economics, or the actors that we study, as enculturated actors who are deeply influenced by the social environment, where we have preferences that are endogenous to this environment, and where we sort of like expand the analysis of behavioral economics beyond those situational framing effects. And there's a lot of methodological discussion currently on, this is my last slide, on sort of one of the methodological ramifications of this strand 2 behavioral economics. One is to dethrone randomized controlled trials. They're important, but they're not the only methodological tool in town to study, interventions. Now, why is that the case? Well, when you think about this problem of endogenous preferences, or we are shaped by our social environment, it's very hard to study that stuff with randomized controlled trials. And it might need a different type of toolbox, such as comparative and historical methods that a few authors recently have actually argued for, to examine how historical forces shape our psychology, including beliefs, attitudes, preferences, norms, etc., and how changes in psychological constructs can actually also influence historical events. That's my contribution. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Malte. Again, very comprehensive, and a lot of things again, came out there that we'll definitely unpack, in our discussion. But before we start, I'll just sort of maybe quickly give my opening remarks as well. I think again, just along the lines of more constructive discussions. Because my opinions are very uniquely shaped because I started off studying the subject as a master's student. Then I founded my company here in India. We were directly working on behavioral interventions with various organizations. And now I'm doing a PhD in public policy with a specific focus on behavioral economics, right? So I've sort of, experienced many of these things like you shared firsthand. And I think overall, I would say that the future is very bright and positive, in light of these current challenges, like you said, in terms of the constructive things that are emerging and the direction that the field is moving into. And just a few things that, I'd like to touch upon, some that have already come out, and I think some would be new for the audience. So the first is in terms of, behavioral economic going beyond nudge, right? So as Dr. Malte stressed that nudging is just one particular component of behavioral economics. And I think as studies are emerging, we've understood, right, better understood their limitations in terms of the effect sizes that they have. And maybe they can have an impact at scale, right? But they don't have the kind of effect that maybe initially we thought they would, right? So sort of the debate is moving away from just nudging, right, towards seeing behavioral economics as a lens towards public policy, right? So you see behavioral economics and behavioral insights as a lens towards solving organizational and policy problems. And I think this is something that I've experienced firsthand. So the kinds of projects that we've also worked on with organizations, they've not just focused on nudging, right? But rather on, how do we integrate this kind of behavioral thinking at a more core and subliminal level into our products and programs, right? So starting from scratch, right? So from understanding the context and the audience to designing different features of products, programs, systems, and incentives that incorporate behavioral economics and behavioral science from the ground up. And I also see this kind of shift in different aspects of public policy. So, as I'm moving ahead in my own doctoral research, many core areas of public policy, like public administration, are becoming new ground for behavioral economics, right? So how do we understand the behavior of bureaucrats better? How do we design those systems and incentives, right, in order to motivate behaviors in the right direction? So really, behavioral economics becomes core to the debate, right? Not just nudging, but we move towards a behavioral lens or behavioral thinking, which again is related to that I versus S sort of lens. Second, just the response that the field has had, like it came out in our discussion so far, that this is actually a good thing, right? And it's not just behavioral economics which is going through this crisis, it's all of the other sciences. And very interesting, because I came across a paper which said that actually people who do not have any background in formal background in psychology are actually good at predicting what kind of studies will not replicate. So they actually have a better than chance likelihood, right? Like you stated, some of these results are too sexy and probably too out of the blue to be true. And so even the layman can probably predict that this won't replicate, right? And I think that's something very interesting that's also come out. And we're moving towards more robust methodologies, right? I think large and mega studies, I think that's, a particular direction that the field is taken, where you have cross-border collaboration between labs and also practitioner units, right? So that you're looking at the robustness of these findings across different contexts and moving towards a more mixed methods approach. So not just focusing on sort of the experiments, right, but also going deeper in terms of why certain things are working and why they are not, right? And I think even in terms of, the research quality and the transparency, so, a lot of changes, I think, being undertaken within the behavioral insights teams, that I sort of interact with my own team and even in academia, in terms of the salience that p-hacking, data dredging, and, many of these questionable research practices have got, and also the positive changes, right, related to pre-registration for the future, right, in terms of what is now coming moving forward. And I think the last part that I would really like to add is that, coming out of all of these crises, questions of contextualization and, where it works, where it doesn't work, and what's the best way to apply it. I really think that, there's a lot of scope and opportunity arising in terms of indigenizing behavioral economics and behavioral science, right? So so we have insights that are built from the ground up, right, on populations that are not, for example, just based on a marginal community like Western educated democratic populations. But we are not just testing these interventions across other areas in India, Vietnam, Indonesia, but we're actually coming out with new and innovative theories of behavior, right, from this. So you're indigenizing public policy and also indigenizing behavioral insights within it. And it's really wonderful to see, so many behavioral teams now emerging here in that direction, and also academic research engaging, in many of these respects. So I would like to end sort of, just some of my thoughts on this topic, and I would like to now just open up the floor, for discussion, right? So I think the first question I would like to add is that, we have a lot of discussion on, of course, cross-border collaboration and lab-to-lab collaboration, but, we have a really nice mix of panelists here who are practitioners and also academics. So one thing I would like to understand is, how do you see the academic practitioner collaboration, right, in terms of creating a more robust future of behavioral economics, and what that should look like, and what kind of changes perhaps should come in? So this time, Dr. Pavan, it will be great to hear your thoughts, and then Dr. Malte, you can give your inputs.
No, thank you. Thanks, both of you, for that excellent sort of excellent insights that you have added. And I'm almost 100% in agreement with everything that both of you have said. So focusing specifically on the academic practitioner connect, I think it's a very interesting connection. There are two different worlds. On one hand, the academics depend on the discourse of falsification, as Malte has said. This is the Popperian tradition. So basically, when you present in a seminar, people, in a very friendly manner, try to strike down your hypothesis, right? I mean, not with a view to sort of insulting you, but with a view to strengthening your, your research, as it were. So falsification is integral to the way academics think. But that's not the way practitioners think. And by practitioners, in my case, it's typically the government. And the government, in particular the bureaucracy, does not depend on falsification, but it depends on corroboration. Why? Because they want to minimize the cost of divergence, in some sense. That's the nature of the beast, in some sense, of bureaucracy, in some sense, right? So these two worlds collide. That's the first point. That's the first point of collision which needs to be managed in some sense. So how do you take evidence from the scientific world and take it to the world of the practitioner? In my case, the bureaucracy is a difficult challenge, and this challenge is attended by another complication, and that is the following: the practitioner has a form of a bias. I call it the bias is lent by the fact that the practitioner, typically the practitioner is in a position of power, as in my case, and they meet certain types of people who come to them with information. And so there is a serious selection bias in terms of the information that they get. And that selection bias is attended by a certain amount of conflict of interest, because the people who come to meet me because I'm a civil servant, is that they want to give me information of a particular kind because they have some ulterior motive. And that then becomes a form of professional empiricism, which may still be better than no data, but professional empiricism leads you to systematic deviations from what you could accomplish if you were to send 5 qualitatively trained researchers into the field and collect a random sample and then get that data, right? So how do you as an academic take that evidence and how do you make it salient within the government or within the practitioners world is a very difficult. That is something that needs to be thought through. One final comment that I would like to make is that for scientists, for social scientists, for empiricists, to be wrong is actually not a bad thing, as Malte has said. Being falsified is actually knowledge. You have created knowledge, and that's a good thing. Whereas for a consultant professional, being wrong is a bad thing. So there's a challenge with incentives as well. So when I go into the public policy world, I wear my my failures as a badge of my integrity. I'm not a consultant. I'm a non-profit organization, and as a scientist, I need to be able to say, I'm sorry, it hasn't worked, and I can afford to do that. But a consultant doesn't, and consultants can then become systematically dangerous in the world of public policy, and that's sort of a thought I want you to leave you with.
Thank you, Dr. Pavan. Yeah, Dr. Malte, please go ahead.
Yeah, Pavan, again, excellent. I could just stop here and we can go home. This was a great summary of the tensions. I want to add another group of players here that we often tend to forget. These are the citizens. I mean, we often have a debate, right, between the academics. The academics have the incentive structure. We have the practitioners. The practitioners have the incentive structure. And there's an incentive structure when these groups come together, as you rightly said, Pavan. Now, I want to motivate a view, not just behavioral economics and how it's applied in public policy, but the whole happiness research agenda. Well, the happiness research agenda is interesting because, it was driven, of course, you could say, on the one hand, by philosophical, theoretical insights on what constitutes happiness. On the other hand, politicians saw there was a latent dissatisfaction with GDP only, right? And then you had sort of this, a debate between, people proposing certain happiness interventions and practitioners trying sort of like to sell it to the politicians. Now, what is striking is how long it took the field of happiness research to see that citizen participation and citizen involvement in the construction of subjective well-being is essential. Because you can easily have a debate above and beyond community concerns, right? And I think this is, of course, a standard critique, an important critique of the whole field of development economics, but it's also a standard critique of some of the ways we practice actually behavioral economics or behavioral public policy. It's very easy to have a debate about nudging and neglect actually the people who we nudge. So how can we actually include those people that we try, ultimately want to help them to have a better life, to have a seat at the table? I don't have an easy answer to that. There are, deliberative channels. There's debates about, ways to do that. Ireland recently had like a series of very successful citizen assemblies. But you can also see Ireland is a small country, quite homogenous. How do you do that in India? Quite different. But maybe on a state level in India, one could start, with these things. And there are initiatives, of course, that are going in that direction. I think that's important. And the behavioral public policy world to see, it was largely a debate between experts, practitioners, and politicians. And the citizen involvement was often very passive as those who were studied and ultimately nudged. And I think that's important. And it's a challenge. I don't have an answer, but I think it's an important point to consider.
Absolutely, Professor. And I think a really great point, and I think ties back to what I was also trying to say about. I think so. This kind of critique is for policy making as a whole, right? So how do we indigenize policy making so that we bring people to the center when you have so many diverse incentives from the bureaucracy, politicians to all of the different actors. Again, that ground up approach, right, where the entire policy design process, which is now coming out as a method. Maybe behavioral insights can fit in there, right? In terms of the insights that it brings in and how it adds value to some of these core procedures, that exist in policy and what are taken as granted in terms of how you should design policies to now integrating that, behavioral insight and that behavioral thinking. I think what I'll do now is that I'll take a few questions from the audience because, many have been arriving. There's one related to artificial intelligence, and I think Dr. Pawan also touched upon this initially. So, where is the overlap between AI and behavioral economics, and perhaps what does the future look like, for both of these fields? So, are they independent? Do you think they can get integrated? So, Dr. Pawan, would be great to get your opinion first, and then.
Well, thank you for asking a very difficult question.
Yeah.
Let's start off with the opportunities, right? I think it's a very powerful combination, right? I mean, it's a tidal wave that's coming at us. But to talk about the opportunities, I would like to borrow from what Senil Mullainathan has been talking about, which is how AI methodologically is able to integrate two contending ends in one sense. So if you were to look at sociology as a subject, as against economics, I mean, when you run an experiment in economics, you have one dependent variable and then you try and wiggle some other thing and then try and find a causal relationship between the two. But in sociology, you're bothered about context, about a million things that happen in a particular area. And what Sendel says is the following, that AI is the first time that methodologically we are able to reconcile the fact that there are a million variables that determine an outcome variable and build a model. That model may not be as straightforward as a straight line or a simple graph, but it's some model, right? So it can build a model, but at the same time avoid a statistical problem called overfitting. And that is the beauty of AI. And it manages to do that because it partitions the data set into multiple pieces, and then it goes through a loop, right? And that is the sort of the core. So the brilliant opportunity that we have in front of us is that AI allows us methodologically to reconcile the heterogeneity of sociological context with model building, which is beautiful, right? And in some sense, it promises to take us beyond the paradigm of experiments. I mean, experiments have problems, RCTs have problems, and because external validity is a serious challenge. I think Malte has talked about the work by Deaton and Nancy Cartwright there. He's mentioned that, right? I mean, external. So I think AI is now able to take us beyond, right? But of course, there is still the residual challenge within the field of AI, which is causal analysis. They're talking about synthetic controls and so on. But I think AI is a great promise methodologically in telling us something about society. But the flip side is kind of concerning, and that is, what will AI in combination with behavior science do to our autonomy? Because now we are able to target segments of the population and send subliminal messages or send messages which can potentially change people's behavior. And Malte just talked about how do we involve the public. And here, involving the public in almost a deceptive manner, which can compromise on their autonomy. So the cost of loss of autonomy. See, I can move from point A to point B. I can make more money, but you're not factoring in the loss, the cost of loss of autonomy that I feel, even though I have more money at point B. And that is an important intuition. And that's not a trivial cost that human beings face for being deceptively led to a point. And that's the loss of liberty in some sense, right? So how do we deal with that? Now, the question is, do we regulate AI? Or do we allow competition within AI, right? So do we allow the concentration of the suppliers of AI services in the few hands? Because that's likely to happen now. There are very few. So intellectual property of AI should, I think, be examined very closely. I think you need to make it more of a public good, right? So I do think that regulation and law need to step into the field of AI to make it a more even playing field and make it more useful to society, because there is the immense danger of it actually affecting human welfare in a negative manner.
Thanks. Yeah.
I just want to emphasize the point that Pavan made towards the end, that there are many tools, including AI combined with the behavioral insights world, that could help us improve welfare along certain axes. Become richer, on the one hand, become potentially healthier, optimize, our sleep, you name it. Okay. And there are these chances how we can tailor and individualize policies. The flip side, as Pavan nicely said, is what does it do to our autonomy? How much are we aware of what's going on behind the scene? And I want to emphasize a scholar that you all know that was very influential for me, who was Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen says we can understand autonomy not just as instrumental reasoning, right? So we have a certain goal, and now the government or the nudger or the AI helps us to get to this goal. That's not autonomy. That's instrumental reasoning. What autonomy is largely about is, yes, instrumental reasoning, but particularly reasoning about ends, right? That we can see our own positionality, transcend it, and critically think about the ends that we're pursuing. And by and large, I think AI and also behavioral interventions so far haven't done enough to help people think about the ends that they're pursuing and trade off various ends that we all are pursuing in our lives. And you could say, that's the beauty now about education and what we're all doing. We're all engaging in a collective endeavor to not just become better boosted instrumental reasoners, but to be substantive in our reasoning, also about our goals. And that ultimately is what constitutes autonomy. And I think we really have to engage in this debate that ultimately transcends the narrow boundaries of behavioral sciences and engages with some of the more normative aspects of what we all do.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. And again, I think this also connects with what you previously shared about co-production, right? And how perhaps AI and behavioral insights both come together within that common framework. And I think there are also like many limitations toward that because people have so many opinions on how things should be done, and those are just some of the practical challenges that come with co-production and this kind of policy making, even when it comes to behavioral insights. So do people really know, what the right end is? And if something like this is being designed, then I mean, people come from all kinds of backgrounds, like even in a country like India, right? So really, because you can get overloaded with so many opinions, then that's sort of, another challenge. But I think I'd like to pose one more question. I think we're running out of time, but a lot of people have been asking about, what's in it for me in a sense, right? So there are a lot of students who are interested in behavioral economics and behavioral science. Of course, I also teach at ISPP, and this question emerges quite often. And I think it will be great to get, the panel's opinion here on what the future of behavioral economics looks like for enthusiasts and students, right? So if I'm getting into this field, then, why should I get in, right? What's exciting for me in the future, for example? So Dr. Pawan and then Dr. Marte will hear from you.
Again, a difficult question. So I think that a lot of students are drawn to behavioral science and behavioral economics because of the sexiness, right? I mean, you read Nudge and it's so easily accessible and so on. And as Malte has rightly pointed out, the impact of nudges is somewhat limited. But going beyond nudges, there are structural features which I think one needs to pay attention to. For instance, this whole business of social norms that Christina Bicchieri talks about, right? That's a very powerful set of tools. And if you were to look at the different ways in which you can change human behavior, even if we allow ourselves to change other people's behavior, if you're so arrogant as to do that, of course, you have markets where prices can change human behavior. Then you have formal institutions, laws, which change human behavior. Then you have nudges, and then you have information and narratives and so on. And then you have social norms, which are very, very powerful instruments of social. And norms are not that easy to change necessarily, right? So, I mean, to look at behavior science in a sort of a broader sense, in a social sense, I think would be really useful. So go beyond the Sunstein Taylor popular book or the Danner. They're very nice. They're very nice books. They welcome you inside and so on. But I think you should also become a bit of a producer of your own knowledge. Allow yourself to acquire the skills to produce knowledge or consume knowledge in a good way. You can be a sort of a discerning consumer of knowledge. I would strongly urge you to do that as a student. It's an exciting field, and in combination with AI, this is going to rule the world, whether you like it or not. But welcome.
Just to briefly add on, I know we're at the end of our time, but I can just encourage all of you to not fall prey to some of the negativity that we're currently having about the field, because the field is evolving. The field is not what it was in the early 2000s. It is evolving, and particularly not just on the technological front, what we've heard about AI, but really also behavioral economics has become more open to consider also some other insights from sociology, other theories of psychology, not just, the heuristics and biases approach. There's a whole school, that Gerd Gigerenzer and others are famous for, the idea of ecological rationality. Christina Bigeri's work on social norms. There's a rich set of untapped potentials when you study both economics and psychology, and it's not just running another experiment on the dictator game and trying to see that people have altruistic preferences. I think seeing behavioral economics as part of a larger endeavor in the behavioral sciences that incorporates insights from sociology is, I think, really an exciting path for many of you who might want to do the, grad school, PhDs, or masters. I think, and the one final thing I want to say is there are very, very important policy insights from that. Standard economics is good for certain things, but it's certainly not nuanced. I want to end on this note.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think, we've had a really wonderful discussion, and just to bring it all together, I think we touched on some of those controversies, right? But then we moved the discussion towards a more constructive environment. And I think we really sort of reached the frontier, right? In terms of co-production, AI, indigenization, interdisciplinarity. And I think the richness of our discussion, again, just reflects, right, how exciting this field is, how broad this field is. And as someone, who is also going through it, as a young practitioner and also academic, I completely agree with everything that the panel shared, right? Because there's so much scope for you to make individual impact. And most definitely, public policy, right, is an area where there is significant amounts of integration of the science, and potentially also the largest impacts, right? As many of the problems that we face now in terms of, many of the economies wanting, aging very drastically, right? So how do we move some of the Southeast Asian countries towards healthier aging, or even climate change, are at their core behavioral problems, right? So the contribution of the science will only move forward. So with that, I would like to wrap it up and just, I think, invite Jose again. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karan. And it was really intriguing, actually. Like you have taken us through the roller coaster of behavioral sciences, the challenges it faces, and the solutions that it is coming up. And as you mentioned, it is an evolving area, and it would have its place on the world, which will be ruled by AI in the coming days. And I would like to thank Dr. Pavan for being a part of this discussion and talking about the system of incentives that is very much needed in the area of research. And I would like to thank Professor Malte Dold, who posed the question of replicability in behavioralism and the need to go beyond what we have to carry out more meta research and innovate ourselves. Thank you. And I would also like to thank our moderator, Karan, for ensuring the smooth flow of this discussion and intervening in between and asking critical questions and improving the entire discussion. Thank you, Karan.
Thank you.
Yeah, and also lastly, I would like to announce that if anyone has any questions about ISPP, we will be available here. The dean is there, so we can stay back for some time and we can clarify your questions. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all. I hope I see you all soon in person. My wife is actually from Ahmedabad, so I have a reason to also travel to India. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Parth. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Pod.
Thank
Welcome.
you. Bye.